Idan Segal from Convergence Partners. Convergence is an investment company. We invest in the ICT sector only and across Africa, where we take generally minority equity stakes in projects or companies either that we create or that people invite us to. The headline analysis of the sector we're in will focus on kind of obvious metrics like 650 odd million mobile subscribers and the GSM operators, and it is the natural place to start. But that sector's becoming increasingly competitive, and from a convergence point of view, that's not where we focus our efforts. I think when you analyze this undoubted success that the ICT sector has experienced in the past 2 decades since mobile came along in Africa, one needs to dig a level below, and then you'll find a more complex picture of areas of huge success and areas of challenges that have been spoken about for a long period of time and have really not been addressed. And I guess the key metric in our mind there is the digital divide. And a scary statistic from our point of view is that, notwithstanding the huge success that our sector has seen and the increase in adoption of mobile services, if one measures the digital divide both on an urban versus a rural basis, but also on a sub-Saharan Africa versus rest of world, and not just developed world, but versus developing market peers, the gap's actually increasing. And I think the reason it's increasing is that broadband, which is clearly the next wave, as Keith's alluded to, is a hugely capital-intensive business and frankly much lower margins than the traditional voice business, but that's the way the market's going. And the issue is the model that's evolved to get us to this point in time in terms of network rollout for voice in the traditional GSM business. Frankly, it's not going to work in the next phase of our sector. And we have to pick up on the shared infrastructure point that Keith made. In years that have gone by, operators were cash flush and they could afford to invest in their own infrastructure. It was a competitive advantage. You used to see adverts saying our network reaches here and there and our competitors don't. Clearly that's not the case anymore. Much more competitive, less free cash flow for investment. So the investment case to unlock the next wave of infrastructure investment, which is going to be a multiple of size bigger than what we've seen to date, needs to come from a different model. So in answer to the question of where are we focusing our efforts and where do we see returns, it's the model whereby shared infrastructure on a wholesale open access basis is adopted, and these operators that are used to having owned all of their own infrastructure will actually become effectively customers. So we've been investing in open access infrastructure such as CCOM, so the New Dawn satellite, but I think this is really the start of when that model needs to accelerate. And for that model to take off, there's some not insignificant challenges on the policy and regulatory front and on the market commercial front, where there's a history and a type of behavior that perhaps and a mindset that needs to change. So we look for either to develop or to find existing projects that leverage these open access wholesale principles. It is a challenging space, but we found that if you find the right project in the right space, the returns are still there. So I think wholesale infrastructure is the first answer. And then on the other end of the spectrum is when we also casting an eye to the future and saying, at a point in time, there hopefully will be pervasive infrastructure for people to access fairly and offer services fairly. So where will the growth come from? And there's some very exciting early stage, new, high risk opportunities in the more venture side of our business relating to OTT services, mobile apps. The barriers to entry to create your own application or your own content are falling, and Africa is a hugely price sensitive, demand elastic market. So as soon as the prices fall through competition and access to infrastructure, we see a continued boom in the sort of successes we've seen in bespoke applications. So M-Pesa is the obvious one in the financial services, but the amount of interest and the amount of development we're seeing from young entrepreneurs around the continent wanting to leverage what will hopefully become an accessible ICT infrastructure is very encouraging. Probably a bit new and fresh for a lot of investors, so it's not yet at the stage certainly where banks would be looking, but I think as an African citizen and investor, it's a hugely encouraging trend. That is the key challenge at the moment. There are different avenues people use to influence policy, some of which are probably more effective than others. To pick up on your point, is the industry speaking as a whole and explaining what it needs. It's a critical point. There was a time when undersea cables, when this new raft were coming along, and they were actually getting blocked from landing. So there is a consultation and a process that needs to happen between the various stakeholders. I guess not just Africa, but the whole world's come from a place where there's traditionally quite a complex and frankly conflicted position that governments found themselves in, because typically all the infrastructure was owned by monopoly telcos, and the government owned the telco historically. So to open up the sector on the one hand gives rise to short-term pain in terms of losing revenues from your own owned entity. Another example of that, I guess, is when you have access to new, for example, spectrum, and there's a huge desire to go the auction route and maximize the value that a particular country can receive by auctioning off that spectrum. And those are understandable positions, but in the long run, those actually do more harm than good. So a big part of it is industry consultation to say, and there's a huge amount of statistical and research work that backs us up, but countries are net beneficiaries by a multiple of whatever the forfeited auction revenues would be. So it's a complex interaction. I'd say it's made more complex because the industry doesn't always speak with the same voice. There are people who are pushing different agendas within the industry, but I think it's important that they come together and continue the dialogue. The sectors in the phase that the World Bank alluded to, at the moment probably the bulk of the profits are accruing to the mobile operators. But coming back to the comments we're making about price sensitivity, our view is once you get to, it's been proven in terms of how this industry has progressed so far and needs to happen continually, but once the price points are at the appropriate levels, the demand for these services is huge. So it's the price volume interaction and the pent-up demand is not to be underestimated. So just getting to the point where there are 1 billion, not 600 odd million mobile phones is step one. If there's sufficient broadband capability of those phones, you've now put a hugely powerful device into every single person's hands. And I think both from the big company side, we mentioned the M-Pesas and the SAPs, but also from the small entrepreneur side, if the price points are right, the level of ingenuity and entrepreneurship, I think in Africa is not to be underestimated. It's just about getting the tool at the right price point into people's hands. So we see the amount of interest, as I say, not all of it's, most of it's probably not bankable at this point in time, but as availability increases, so the level of sophistication and, I guess, bespoke tailoring for local conditions is increasing dramatically. It's an interesting time for the sector. Their views that a lot of the growth has been extracted already. I don't think we share that view. I think we do, though. We are of the view that a different model is needed going forward. This has really got to be a complete broadband revolution. Voice was just the start and frankly the easy part. So it requires a different model going forward. But I think the benefits have been proven around the world and in Africa that once you have ubiquitous broadband at affordable prices, the level of innovation and entrepreneurship and game-changing ability that's been put into hundreds of millions of people's hands is just a hugely exciting opportunity for the continent. So we're doing whatever we can to drive availability up and prices down. And I think it's an exciting space for many years to come.
Doing business in Africa, you can't afford to be without Africa Investor.